I'm not sure. Give it to Jesus. I don't know like this.
We thank Prime Minister for his speech. To continue the debate and deliver the clash, we call Leader of Opposition. Hear.
Am I audible? May I begin? Mr. Speaker, before I move on to my constructives, 2 points of rebuttals. Right? Firstly, we hear coming from side government that nuclear proliferation in NPT, let's use the acronym for economizing time, in a certain way ensures that states get perverse incentives to acquire more nuclear weapons, and in that situation you have a far more nuclearized world. What we argue is slightly more simplistic, but definitely more real, which is, Mr. Speaker, that under mutually assured destruction, where unlike in case of NPT, where you do not have a global supervisory mechanism, where you do not supervise not only which states possess nuclear weapons, but you also supervise where the supplies of nuclear fuel and nuclear technology comes from, it is far more easier under an MAD paradigm to simply acquire nuclear weapons, Mr. Speaker. And what you must understand is that this entire argument that Anil provided was dependent on the fact that certain countries in the world happen to be security providers in their regions, right? And they happen to be hegemons. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is not true that these countries happen to be hegemons merely because of nuclear weapons. These countries happen to be hegemons because they are geopolitical hegemons as such. Hence, the retaliatory impact that some reactionary countries will feel to these hegemons would exist under NPT as well as under MAD. Under our model, given that model, given that you are ensuring that there are at least greater checks on the availability of nuclear weapons, resources and technology, you ensure that there are absolutely lesser number of nuclear weapons. The second point, Mr. Speaker, is with regard to how the world simply refuses to act against a superpower like Russia when they go and attack Crimea, in spite of the fact that there are powers against Russia who are nuclear powers. We believe that this entire argument was based on very, very wise mischaracterization. Mr. Speaker, for 2 reasons, right? First is that, well, the fact that being a nuclear power amounts to being a superpower is far more true under a MAD model than it is under an NPT model, Mr. Speaker. Because what you must understand is that under an NPT model, there will still be n number of economic superpowers, or political superpowers, or strategic superpowers who need not be nuclear security providers, Mr. Speaker. As against that, if you talk about an MAD paradigm, every state can show power only by virtue of possessing nuclear weapons, because that becomes a major bargaining chip on the geopolitical bargaining table, right? In that situation, we believe that they start from a very flawed point. If in any case we take up the only example that they use to justify the argument here, we believe that the major reason why people did not go and intervene in Russia is not because of anything but for the fact that it would have taken the American forces close to around half a month to 1 month to actively reach Ukraine and intervene there, Mr. Speaker. And most importantly, what you must understand is it's extremely difficult to act militarily against a country like Russia, not because of its military capabilities, but because of its sheer size. In any case, Mr. Speaker, if people have kept up with news, we would all know that Russia is getting horribly screwed for doing things that it did to Ukraine on all fronts, including economic and military, right? And with that, I'll move on to my constructions. I'll take you in a bit. Mr. Speaker, what you must understand is that right now in the world, you have certain countries who act as security providers and who are responsible for maintaining stability in their regions, in their own interest, and in the interest of states who are considered to be allied to them. And we believe that if nuclear weapons will remain in the world, it should, if at all, it should remain under the supervision and control of these states, because they have a legitimate interest in protecting the stability of the world, as against them getting proliferated into the hands of countries who are not necessarily as rational as the MAD paradigm assumes all nations to be. In that situation, Mr. Speaker, we argue for a check at the level of possessing nuclear weapons, as against them arguing for a check at the level of use of nuclear weapons, and no check at the level of possessing them. Mr. Speaker, what we also tell you, sit down, I'll take you in the field. What we also tell you is that under the model of mutually assured destruction, which essentially, like Anil put down, is reliant on the fact that you are so scared of X country's second strike capability that you will not first strike them, you leave out a large number of countries in the world, Mr. Speaker. And they are as follows. One is what happens to those countries who simply do not possess nuclear power. Under your model, because of the fact that now nuclear power is the only way to exact your right, as I was stating before, you are equating nuclear capability with superpower, disregarding all the other factors, Mr. Speaker. Hence, these countries who are non-nuclear get absolutely pigeonholed into being vassal states of other nations, Mr. Speaker, and have no autonomy whatsoever. Moreover, what happens to countries who are not rational actors for the sake of their desperation, for the sake of their familial dictatorships, for the sake of their nationalism and such other things? Mr. Speaker, we're talking about countries like North Korea, which left the nuclear proliferation regime. Moving on, Mr. Speaker, what we also tell you is that given under a MAD model, you are creating far more incentives for countries to go out and acquire nuclear weapons, because so many more countries have nuclear weapons because there's no check to possession. You ensure that you also strengthen the global black market supply of nuclear weapons, and also because you are not checking that supply of nuclear weapons in the first place because you don't have a comprehensive regime, it becomes far more easier to acquire weapons from the black market. Before I move on, I'll take a look.
You're conflating the fact that more countries will have nuclear weapons with the fact that more countries will now use these nuclear weapons. Under our model, even if a lot more countries have nuclear weapons, it's less likely that they're going to use it, which is the analysis we provided.
Right, so even if we accept that paradigm, that you will not end up using nuclear weapons by merely possessing them, we believe that the NPT model is far more profitable. And here are the reasons, Mr. Speaker. First is, as I have told you already, it is easier under an NPT, comprehensive NPT model, when you are enforcing it, to ensure that you have a check and observatory mechanism on the way that this nuclear technology itself is being used. In that situation, the distinction that comes in is not between possessing nuclear weapons and using them, but between possessing nuclear technology, using them for clean purposes, and using them for weaponized purposes, Mr. Speaker. And that distinction can be effectively drawn only under an NPT regime, which we believe is extremely important for countries who are not security providers or who are not mature enough to be security providers. In that situation, Mr. Speaker, one simple comparative to end my speech. Why exactly did the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1 work better than the START 2, Mr. Speaker? Because when the START 1 was being implemented, there were simply lesser number of nuclear states who were hegemons, Mr. Speaker. Hence, it was easier to bring about a streamlined process of disarmament. Under START 2, with no NPT, you have more nuclear powers. Hence, it's much harder to bring about nuclear disarmament with a bargain in the world. And for all these reasons, we stand to oppose. Thank you.
We take Leader of Opposition for a speech to continue the debate. For government, we call Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah, sorry.
Our two primary responses to what the leader of the opposition said is, we agree with you, and so what? Because we think a lot of what he said simply wasn't relevant with regard to what we pointed out from Prime Minister, right? What were his first problems? What are his problems? First, he said, is that under the nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation regime, there are greater checks that exist. We simply don't think that's true, right? Because we tell you that if a country simply wants to acquire a nuclear weapon, such as North Korea or such as Iran, we think it can play on the rivalry that exists between existing nuclear powers, such as between China and the United States, and can acquire nuclear weapons or the ability to acquire nuclear weapons from such states. In the current regime, if you're a rogue actor that simply wants nuclear weapons, there are more than enough ways to acquire it from countries that may be sympathetic to your cause, or countries that see you as a country that can now become a tool for them, right? Such as that if China continues to give some sort of ability, some sort of help to North Korea to acquire nuclear weapons, they can use North Korea effectively as a threat to nullify any sort of strategic gains that the United States might want to make in the Asia-Pacific region. So that sort of thing doesn't really remain. We think that even if you enter into a mutually assured destruction regime, that sort of pattern of countries entering into agreements with other countries to try and acquire nuclear weapons, to try and clear nuclear material, will still end up existing. However, right now, in a mutually assured destruction regime, they don't necessarily need to do this under the radar, right? They don't need to hide from the public eye and try to do this. We think the likelihood of knowing which countries are right now trying to acquire nuclear weapons and knowing what nuclear weapon capabilities are of each country will become significantly more open in a mutually assured destruction regime. There'll be a lot more openness and transparency. The point about checks doesn't matter. Secondarily, even when he talks about the point of checks, we say so what, right? Because that's the exact point of our stance, right? We think it's perfectly fine if more and more countries end up acquiring nuclear weapons, because we believe that the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the less likely they're going to use it. We don't think that in any point of his speech, Rudro pointed out a link between possessing nuclear weapons and the likelihood of using that nuclear weapon, right? Which is why he again mentioned this link of, well, that there are countries that are hegemons, and they use certain other countries as vassal states. We agree with that. We think that yes, hegemons do exist. We think that hegemons aren't necessarily linked only to nuclear weapons. It's linked to economic powerhouse, it's linked to economic ability, it's linked to any sort of political partnerships that you may already have with other countries. We think that, in fact, in a nuclear in a mutually assured destruction regime, the self-interest that certain countries have, that will continue to exist. The idea that you should promote stability in the world, the idea that you should ensure that countries that are friendlier to your aims, that share certain common economic goals, that you will continue to be allied with them, will end up existing. The same kind of incentives in terms of promoting stability will exist in terms of entering into allies. However, right now, what will change fundamentally are the two major harms that we pointed out that emerge from the nuclear non-proliferation regime, right? The first is that it creates perverse incentives for countries to use the threat of acquiring nuclear weapons as a bargaining tool to get more and more concessions, right? Such as, if we take North Korea doesn't necessarily need to acquire nuclear weapons. It simply needs to use the threat that we will to ensure that it gets concessions with regard to aid, with regard to certain sanctions from being lifted from the United States, even though it might be in an authoritarian regime that tramples upon the human rights of its citizens. We want to end that kind of perverse incentive. We want to ensure that you simply cannot use nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons as a tool to gain concessions, but that any decision to enter into it should be because you want to promote your own security, should be because you want to ensure that you are protected from the neighbors and that you can hold your head high and be an active member of the global community, right? Not because you simply want to use it as tools to gain concessions. The second aspect of this is that this ends up creating a certain sense of dependency within certain countries, right? Because in the current regime, say you're a country that isn't very militarily strong, that isn't economically very powerful, right? If you want to protect your security, if you want to be secure against the threat of other countries that have nuclear weapons, or then you have to enter into agreements with those countries, rival countries, right? For instance, if you're Ukraine, right, and you want to protect yourself from the threat of Russian annexation, you cannot acquire nuclear weapons by yourself, but you have to enter into agreements with the United States or with France or UK to end up ensuring that they protect you. However, what that means is that these other countries now have control over your actions to some extent, right? Because what they will now do is try to ensure that there are favorable conditions that are imposed on you, say with regard to an economic free trade agreement between the US and the Ukraine, or in terms of any kind of concessions that Ukraine now needs to give to American or European citizens, right? These may not be in Ukraine's self-interest. And these simply may not be to ensure that Ukraine can now end up actually becoming safer from the threat of Russian annexation, as was pointed out recently, right? Because even though these countries use the ability to give them some sort of protection as an ability, actually before I move on here.
under your model, North Korea will not nuclearly attack the USA because they are afraid that the USA will attack them back. Why do you think North Korea will care about a retaliation from the USA, the leader of North Korea?
Because he'll still die. And everybody around him will die. And North Korea will not exist anymore. That sort of threat would remain in both stages, right? The question is not really about will countries that are led by mad people still be mad, right? The question is that in the current regime, will countries now not be able to use nuclear weapons as a bargaining tool? Will they be able to act more efficiently in their self-interest? And will there be a world order that is significantly more fair and that reduces the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons, right? Because we tell you that, again, continuing with the Ukraine example, again, even though Ukraine might have to enter into these sort of agreements with the EU or with the US, even with the threat of Russian annexation of Crimea shows, they're not going to enter into any kind of protection of Ukraine because they would have own independent economic agreements or independent considerations with regard to Russia, right? So that sort of concession simply doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, we tell you that in the current regime, it smacks of favoritism, which makes other countries less likely to want to follow the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well, right? US and Australia might be okay with India acquiring nuclear weapons, other countries may not. So the idea of sticking to the Non-Proliferation Regime simply doesn't hold true. For these various reasons, we're proud to propose.
We thank Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. To continue the debate for opposition, we call Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
May I start? Ladies and gentlemen, mutually assured destruction presumes that while even if countries haven't been rational while exercising the choice to acquire nuclear weapons, they will necessarily exercise the choice to use those nuclear weapons rationally. As Anil himself pointed out, countries have acquired nuclear weapons in the past, not for the most rational of reasons, because they feel that some kind of nationalistic pride in acquiring those nuclear weapons, because they feel that they need to go against these Western democracies which are telling them not to acquire nuclear weapons. We cannot leave the fate of these countries and the fate of the world to the economic analysis that is going to be made by one dictatorial leader who is not maybe fully capable of making that analysis. So if I'm the leader of North Korea and I know that I can hide in a bunker in the event of a nuclear strike and I'm not really accountable to my people, I have no reason to care that the entire population of North Korea will be wiped out as long as I can take my own family and hide under that bunker and survive, because I'm an egomaniac and I really don't care what happens to the rest of my people. So we think that in those scenarios, it's not really likely that these countries are going to exercise that option of using nuclear weapons in the most rational of manners. What happens in a non-proliferation regime? We think that because there is a supervisory structure and because there is a formal agreement as opposed to an implicit understanding which is not codified, which does not actually state that you cannot use nuclear weapons, or which can only take actions once those nuclear weapons have already been used, at which point it sort of becomes redundant. We think that once somebody moves out of this agreement or moves out of this regime, it is A, far easier to find out that they have moved out of this regime, but secondly, it's easier to supervise or use some kind of surveillance techniques to figure out what exactly they are building or what exactly they are doing with that nuclear technology. Something which is more difficult to do in the case of a mutually assured destruction regime, because you can't figure out there at which point these countries start using this nuclear technology in a destructive manner. We think that's what the problem is. The second point that they came up with was that now in our situation, this whole thing will simply go underground. China will start providing nuclear technology to North Korea. We're telling you that that sort of thing can still happen, and it's more likely to happen in a regime of mutually assured destruction. Why is it more likely to happen there? Because the currency of the world, the currency of power in the world has become nuclear weapons. So that many more nations would now want to or be so dependent on nuclear power that they will have to form this nexus with a nuclear power and request that that country give it that kind of nuclear technology. That's not something that needs to be done in a case where only responsible powers who anyway don't have any incentive to use this nuclear power because of the kind of a moral backlash that they will get, but secondly, the kind of loss of economic power that they will have to face, or the kind of hegemonic power that they enjoy, we think that in these cases, those responsible powers anyway don't have an incentive to do something that is wrong. So we think that when the currency of the world becomes nuclear power, we think that it's far more likely that these ties between countries that don't have nuclear weapons and countries that might just want to use these weapons as puppets is going to be created. I'm going to offer you two constructors, right? First, that when you have a regime of non-proliferation, the discourse shifts from whether or not what point you should use nuclear weapons at, and to whether nuclear weapons are a good idea at all. The discourse shifts to whether nuclear weapons in any situation can be a justifiable means of recourse. The second constructor that I'm going to offer is that while mutually assured destruction rests on the principle that you are going to be affected equally in the manner that you affect another country, that's not necessarily true. And that's not true because of the concentration of resources that can happen when countries don't necessarily have when countries are not necessarily uranium rich and on their own cannot create nuclear weapons on the same level that a group of countries who have pooled their resources can do so. Yes.
The fatal assumption that's necessary for the success of your model is that under the non-proliferation regime, these supervisory safeguards will stop other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. But Iran and North Korea tell us that that's simply not the case. So the world is going to be a lot more dangerous place under your model when some of these countries have nuclear weapons outside of non-proliferation.
No, it's not going to be more difficult because now the discourse has shifted from whether nuclear weapons can ever be a good idea or any country can have nuclear weapons to that no country should be exercising the power to have nuclear weapons. So currently the reason this model is not working is because these responsible actors, these security providers, don't have that kind of global consensus to actually keep checks on these rogue nations. It's easier to do that when the consensus has shifted from whether or not some countries should be having nuclear weapons and some countries should not, to that no country should be having or no more country should be acquiring nuclear weapons. When you have that kind of global consensus, or when that consensus is created over a period of time, it's far easier to then implement these kind of intrusive measures which impinge on the sovereignty of a particular nation. And we think that's easier to do under our model. It's simply not enough to say that these countries have an incentive to not do these things because then they'll be destroyed. Particularly because if you have an arms race and the supply of nuclear arms is increasing, it's so easy that some of these arms will fall into the hands of non-state actors, into the hands of an actor such as ISIS, which doesn't have control over one particular nation and doesn't really care whether one of those nations gets destroyed or not. So we don't think that that's the kind of calculus that those countries have in mind. But going to my point about shifting of discourse, right? Where at the point when academic writing about nuclear weapons shifts from whether mutually assured destruction can work or not to whether it should at all be used as a principle for maintaining peace in the world, and discourse has shifted to the fact that nuclear weapons should not be used at all. Countries will be under a lot more pressure from their own people and from people around the world to not use nuclear weapons. This actually works. For instance, USA hasn't used nuclear power on the scale that it used it against Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the very reason that the kind of moral backlash it received in the aftermath of such an attack was so great, and it wouldn't want to lose its status as a superpower that the world looks up to and that it can provide security to the rest of the world if it happens to do something like that. But secondly, there happens in the present scenario a concentration of resources. Not every country in its natural state possesses the resources to build nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. What happens then is it makes most sense for countries which are allies already, or countries which already have these resources, to have a collective security regime and decide that if any other smaller country tries to mess with them, they're going to attack in kind and use their full might against that country. We think that that takes away the principle of mutually assured destruction, which is that you can affect another country in equal measure as it affects you. We think once that principle is taken away, there really isn't any reason to use the principle of no first use. And we think once that is taken away, the entire edifice on which mutually assured destruction is built crumbles. Because we think that non-proliferation allows security providers only to have nuclear weapons, and those countries anyway do not use nuclear weapons in the first place because consequences for them are far worse and they actually care about those consequences. We think that it is much better to rely on nuclear non-proliferation.
We thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for her speech. To end the substantive debate for government side, we call government whip. Hear him.
Can I have a phone to time myself?
A timer.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just start.
It's 3:15.
Mr. Speaker, a point of rebuttal before I move on to the clashes in the debate and what the comparative really is. An argument we see coming from DLO is that since there's no equal threat of retaliation in a mutually assured destruction paradigm, because some countries have 100 nuclear weapons and the other country has only 1 nuclear weapon, and that somehow destroys the premise of our argument, we tell you this, right? There's still nuclear weapons. 1 nuclear weapon versus 10 nuclear weapons doesn't matter due to the sheer destruction that a single nuclear weapon causes. So as long as a country has even 1 nuke, no matter whether the other country has like 1,000 nukes and 1,000 more in production, the threat of response from this country with 1 nuclear weapon, the threat of a nuke launching at Washington DC is still too large for the USA or for the EU to go out and bully other countries, right? This argument of this does not stand. However, in a mutually assured destruction paradigm, in a mutually assured destruction paradigm, both countries can still affect the other country in the same manner. Because of the amount of destruction that even 1 nuclear weapon carries out or impacts on the other country, the impact is still in a nuclear war. However, that is not the point. The point is that a nuclear war will never happen, and that is where we get to the clashes in this debate, right? First, we heard a lot of talk about rogue states. And second, the most important comparative is what happens to the world under both paradigms. On the comparative of rogue states, right? We heard a lot of arguments from them about why North Korea is such a bitch and why North Korea is so irrational and why Kim Jong-un doesn't care and he'll just bomb every place, right? We tell you that does not change in an NPT regime. Kim Jong-un is still as crazy in an NPT regime. He's still as reckless. He's still as irrational. He cannot be stopped in either regime. However, in a mutually assured destruction regime, he is disincentivized from entering into a conflict. Why is that? Because in a MAD regime, the threat of retaliation from Southern Korean nuclear missiles is much more greater than the distant threat of retaliation from American missiles, right? Which is why Kim Jong-un is disincentivized from escalating conflicts in his neighbor areas because the threat is equally large. He may be irrational, he may be suicidal, he may still do it. However, he is less likely to do it in a MAD regime because the threat is so much more credible in a MAD regime, right? And then we talked about rogue states, right? We told you that, and this also ties into LO's arguments about why US troops did not attack Russia because it would take them half a month, right? And that is exactly why we do not want to dislocate a small state's ability to defend itself, and we don't want to place it onto other countries with other incentives or with logistical problems in going out and defending the other country, right? We do not think that works. We think when America has to take a month to send its troops, it will not send its troops. Vis-a-vis when Ukraine has its own machinery, has its own weaponry which is equally capable, they will be able to defend themselves, and the responsibility of defending themselves falls upon themselves, which in turn disincentivizes people like Russia, from people like Putin from going out and attacking them because the threat is so credible, right? What else have we heard on the first argument? No. We've heard this entire argument about why in a MAD regime the black market will somehow prosper and why people will start going through backdoor channels. Two responses. First, that happens in an NPT regime as well. It's more likely to happen in an NPT regime. Why? In the current regime, North Korea has military factories in Nigeria, has trade groups in Bulgaria, right? To say that in an NPT regime will stop everyone from having nukes at all is extreme model dependence from opposition who just assume that an NPT regime will work very effectively when we have seen why it doesn't. And second, we have seen why an NPT regime actually incentivizes them to use these backdoor channels, to use these covert channels, because the moment they use proper channels to acquire them, there's a lot of backlash from the international community, which is why they're incentivized to go to the black market, to make the black market more prosperous or a more busy avenue for business. And we know that that is bad because of the possibility of them falling into the hands of non-state actors. As opposed to a MAD regime where everything is done upfront, everything is transparent, there is no incentive to go for a backdoor mechanism, no incentive to have your trade route in Bulgaria. You can just enter into economic deals with other countries and get your own nuclear weapons. And this is the distinction which brings us to the second clash as well. Everyone gets nuclear weapons, but no one uses nuclear weapons in a MAD regime, and that is the crux of the second clash, right? On the issue of the world on the comparative, right, they talked about how we'll have a check at the level of possession. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this check failed and has harms in itself, right? First, it incentivizes countries, as my first two speakers talked about, to use the threat of getting nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip to enter into uneven exchanges or uneven transactions with other countries. Second, this check is not for these designated countries, right? This check is only for the other new countries who want to get nuclear weapons, which makes all the other countries in the world still dependent on these designated countries to defend themselves, right? This is something which my first two speakers talked about why this is such a bad thing. Their response to this was like, now there's going to be like pigeonholing and pawn states because people will transfer, like China, like people will transfer nuclear technology to other countries. We tell you that still happens in an NPT regime. It happens through backdoor channels. We do not know who is getting the nuclear weapon. We are perpetually afraid. North Korea might have a nuclear weapon, might not have a nuclear weapon, as opposed to MAD regime where we know they have a nuclear weapon, but we know that they will not use it. Second thing they talked about in our MAD paradigm, countries without nuclear weapons become absolutely weak. Right? Okay, I'll take you now. Yeah.
So if an irresponsible state which would not have gotten nuclear weapons under an NPT regime now develops a nuclear weapon to entirely strategically wipe out another state without possibility of second strike, why would it restrain itself under MAD?
An irrational state, so irrational that it wants to wipe out the existence of another country, would still have gotten nuclear weapons in the NPT regime. They still do. Iran, North Korea still use backdoor channels. It would still have happened in an NPT regime. To say that these irrational states would be deprived of all nukes is moral dependence from them. We cannot buy this, right? What else, right? They talked about why countries without nuclear weapons will become weak in an MAD regime because everyone else has nukes but they don't. Mr. Speaker, that still happens in an NPT regime. In an MAD regime, however, those that do manage to get nuclear weapons become strong, become able to defend themselves, while others in the status quo have no change under both regimes, which means there's a marginal benefit accruing to these borderline countries in a MAD regime. Let's think on these lines, right? There's Iran and there's a country that Iran hates, right? In an NPT regime, Iran will still go out and get its nuclear weapons and want to destroy the other country. The other country, which may want to abide by their NPT regime, will not get these nuclear weapons, will still be dependent on these signatory countries and will not be able to defend itself, right? This is what happened in their regime. In our regime, where everyone has the right to get nuclear weapons and everyone is allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, the moment this other country knows that Iran is getting nukes to like destroy their existence, they will get nukes back and use that as a credible threat to prevent Iran from attacking them, right? And that is what happens in a mutually assured destruction regime simply because the threat of retaliation, the threat of a second strike, the threat of a preemptive strike is too large. No country will, all of them may acquire nuclear weapons, but no country will ever use their nuclear weapons. And that is the crux of our case, something opposition has failed to understand. And for precisely this reason, we feel that we have won this debate.
We thank Government Whip for his speech. To end the substantive debate, we call Opposition Whip. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Okay. Mr. Speaker, three very simple clashes in this debate. Firstly, whether non-proliferation as a model is harmful as it exists right now. Secondly, whether MAD and the rationale behind it can function in real life. And thirdly, under which model is there more dependency for countries that have a lesser access to nuclear weapons in both models? But before I get to these clashes, two simple points of rebuttals that I haven't incorporated in my substantives for the speech previous to mine. Now, firstly, they talked about why the threat of nuclear weapons and their usage is the same, right? We tell you it really is not. Countries develop abilities to knock out nuclear weapons before they even enter into their atmosphere. Every country cannot develop that ability. Therefore, a country that has developed that ability in the game theory analysis that they've put into under an MAD paradigm would be at a lesser risk of losing their civilians and losing their territory and their property, as opposed to a country which has not developed that ability. Therefore, in this case, nuclear weapon usage is not the same. A country is put on a higher pedestal because A, there is no obligation on him anymore to not use nuclear weapons, and B, he can use nuclear weapons without a very big damage, without a very sizable damage caused to his population. Secondly, we tell you that the entire NATO force bombing one country, which is a small territory, which is slightly poor, somewhere in the Middle East, is very, very different from that one country leaving one stray bomb into New York or Washington City, or New York City or Washington, because the impact of the former is much greater. Every nuclear attack is not the same, and that is something that we must keep in mind. Now, this debate can go on two levels, right? The first level is when a nuclear weapon is used, and the second level is whether that nuclear weapon is used. On the first level, Mr. Speaker, we have won this debate before it even began. Why? Because under our model, if a weapon is used, you are required to not use a nuclear weapon further, which means that under our model, destruction due to the usage of nuclear weapons is much, much lesser, while under their model, the name itself suggests there is a lot of destruction and there's a lot of usage of nuclear weapons. Therefore, when a nuclear weapon is used, they lose because nuclear weapons are being used, and they're now being encouraged to be used because now you can use a nuclear weapon if a nuclear weapon has been used upon you. But secondly, whether this will stop a nuclear weapon from being used is where the debate begins, and which gets me to my first clash, right? Now, they talked about why non-proliferation is harmful, right? They said it doesn't work because the security providers have these nuclear weapons, and since these security providers have these nuclear weapons, other countries want to have nuclear weapons because they see them as threats. And they said that these security providers act as hegemons because of the fact that they have nuclear weapons. We tell you two things. A, security providers so we tell you that security providers under this model will continue to have these weapons anyway, right? We tell you that while they have these weapons, they will also be stronger because they are geopolitical giants generally. So, an MAD will not operate in vacuum. An MAD will operate along with defensive treaties like the NATO. An MAD will operate along with, say, trade relations that uranium-rich countries like Australia or France have with other countries. And when these countries, for their own benefit, form a nexus of countries that are strong in terms of nuclear abilities, they together will be at a better position to hegemonize other countries because now they're at the liberty to use these nuclear weapons, which they have in abundance and which other countries do not. And this also factors into the dependency clash, which is the third clash in this debate. But the point here is that when a country, under an MAD regime, there will be an encouragement for these countries to form a nexus and use their nuclear abilities to hegemonize, as opposed to under an NPT regime, where the security providers do not have any incentive to use the threat of nuclear weapons because that is something that is considered to be bad, that is considered to be horrible. However, the benefits of a nuclear weapon, which will not exist under an MAD, have not been dealt with them. What are they? So we talked about irrational nations, right? Irresponsible nations. We talked about the possibility of leaks, and we talked about how the usage of nuclear weapons will become accepted under discourses, right? But most importantly, we talked about checks, right? We tell you that even if a country that steps out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and decides to arm themselves, a country under an NPT model, it is easier for us to conduct surveillance over these countries, use checks over these countries, and impose sanctions over these countries, because now we have the reference of saying that since you're not allowed to arm yourself in a nuclear fashion, we can do those things. Under an MAD regime, these countries will continue to arm themselves, these countries will continue to be irresponsible, but you cannot impose surveillance on them, you cannot impose checks on them, because that principle that you mustn't arm yourself doesn't exist anymore, which means these countries are much, much more dangerous than they were before. Now, getting to the second clash, they talked about why MOD is good. MAD is good because the threat of attack is the best motivation to not attack, right? And we tell you that therefore these security providers will not use their nuclear weapons and other countries will not use these nuclear weapons as well. We tell you that in order for them to prove this, they have to prove to us why every country will take into consideration this rational analysis about the threat of destruction, right? We tell you that countries do not usually do that, right? We tell you that the only country that can be expected to take into account the considerations that are expected under an MAD regime is a mature democracy that is accountable to its people, that is developed, that is economically strong, and that is stable. Because those are the only countries that have a reason to listen to their people and take into account the destruction or havoc that might be caused to their people. Yeah, go on.
So, see, from the beginning we said that non-proliferation can only work if at the end of the day all countries agree to the idea of non-proliferation. But we said countries have strong reasons to never agree in the first place. Why do you think non-proliferation works?
We tell you non-proliferation works because it does not disallows countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. But if a country does not agree to not acquire nuclear weapons, that is, if a country continues to acquire nuclear weapons, you can impose sanctions on them, you can put checks on them, which you cannot put under an MAD regime. Now, getting back to my point, we tell you that under an MAD regime, the only countries that can be expected to take into account these considerations are the countries that are strong, are the countries that are stable, and are the countries that are accountable. We tell you that these countries also happen to be the security providers under the NPT regime. That is why these security providers are the least risk of using these nuclear weapons, while other countries that are motivated by nationalistic reasons, while other countries that are motivated by, say, other reasons of stupidity, are more likely to use these weapons in the first place, right? We tell you that therefore, since you cannot rely on the irrationality of one government that is not accountable to its people and does not feel responsible for its people, that can use its weapons against this bigger country, against another country, and which can result to a lot of death and havoc, we tell you that an MAD regime fails because the rational considerations that it requires the leaders to take are not taken by these leaders in a lot of circumstances. And for those reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.
We take opposition with first speech to end the debate with opposition. We call opposition replies. Here.
Can I start? Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is about whether we should pin our hopes for the world on nuclear non-proliferation, or should we pin them on the idea that every state, every nation that acquires nuclear weapons will use them in the most rational manner or refrain from using them in the most rational manner. We tell you that we have offered you multiple levels of analysis to show to you why non-proliferation is more likely to work. In response to their continued questions as to whether non-proliferation can work or not, we have told you that because it is a formal agreement, because it is an actual treaty, it's simply harder to violate it in secret. It's harder to pretend that you simply are developing nuclear weapons for some totally different reason, that you're doing something which is in compliance with international law. When all you have in place is an implicit understanding that you will not first use nuclear weapons, it's easier to, in a clandestine manner, develop nuclear capability in an offensive manner, and it is easier to violate the norms that the international community has set for itself. Because it's easier to know when a person is violating, and because it becomes harder to violate a formal treaty than an implicit understanding, it's also easier to keep a check on these nations, to know where they are building nuclear capabilities, to have surveillance over these nations, and also because now the discourse has shifted from whether or not there can be first use to to whether or not there can be nuclear capability at all. And when that global consensus is reached, it becomes easier for responsible security providers to do things which might impinge on the sovereignty of a nation. For instance, by having surveillance over their nuclear capabilities and making sure that they're not developing nuclear weapons, that simply becomes easier to do in a regime where non-proliferation is the norm as opposed to mutually assured destruction. That is the first argument where we told you that nuclear non-proliferation actually works, and their entire argument, which is based solely on the premise that it is not going to work, simply does not stand, right? Secondly, their response to everything that we said was that, well, NPT won't work. States will still be able to acquire weapons. But in a comparative, under our model, it is simply harder to acquire weapons, right? Because there is a check at the level of supply itself. There is a check as to where you are getting your weapons from and whether you can get these weapons in the first place. Bear in mind that under their model, these rogue nations will still be getting these weapons. All that is happening under our model is that you're making it harder for these nations to access those weapons in the first place, which as a preliminary level of check is extremely essential and cannot be eliminated. They haven't told you why necessarily, once these nations have acquired these weapons anyway under the mutually assured destruction paradigm, they will not use them in an irresponsible manner. Just saying that currently North Korea might use the possibility of acquiring nuclear weapons to gain some sort of bargaining power isn't enough, because once it acquires nuclear weapons, that is a far greater threat, and then it can use that as a bargaining chip. So they simply haven't countered that point at all and haven't told us why that works. The third thing we told you, that the very premise of mutually assured destruction, which is that everyone is equally affected by a nuclear strike, simply does not hold. Countries like the European countries or America are more affected because they are accountable to their people, because they have acquired a position in the world where a nuclear strike stands to affect them more. But, however, a country like North Korea or any other undemocratic country which is led by a dictatorial leader who simply wants to satisfy his ego by showing the Western world that he can do something like that is not going to be affected in the same manner. That's why we think that they don't have the incentive to be stable security providers, and they don't have the incentive to use their power in a responsible manner. In a non-proliferation regime, the minute you break the agreement and start acquiring nuclear weapons, you are deemed to be an irresponsible state, and it's far easier to know at which point you start acting in an irresponsible manner. Finally, we told you, even assuming mutually assured destruction does work and nobody will use nuclear weapons, we tell you that our model is better because discourse will change to whether or not nuclear weapons should be used at all. We tell you that there will be less dependency because the currency of the world won't be measured in how many nuclear weapons you have. And finally, we tell you that threats of rogue nations need not be taken as seriously when they don't have nuclear weapons as compared to when they do have nuclear weapons. For all these reasons, we're proud of it.
We take opposition reply for her speech. To end the debate, we call government reply. Here.
The first mistake that side opposition makes in today's debate is that they never establish why non-proliferation is likely to succeed in this debate. We questioned them from the beginning about this. We gave you solid reasons as to why it's very unlikely that countries will enter into a non-proliferation treaty, which is the only thing that they spoke about, right? So they said that, look, this is a formal treaty, and it's quite difficult to break this formal treaty about non-proliferation, which is why they think it works. But the question is, why would these countries even agree to enter into these formal treaties in the first place? That's why what we told you becomes relevant. We said countries don't like this idea that reminds them about colonial concentration of power in the hands of a few states. We said that countries have perverse incentives to not sign this and to try and develop nuclear weapons simply to gain a bargaining chip that they can use for other advantage. All of these means that countries will never even agree to enter into a non-proliferation regime on a mass scale. And that's an assumption that they have made, which is central to their case. And because they haven't established the likelihood of that assumption, they have to lose the debate on that count only. But let's look at the other things that were said in this debate. There was one world that this debate discussed, which was a world where there are irrational leaders leading the country. For example, something like North Korea. So they said that if a country like North Korea has nuclear weapons, the leader is going to now use it to destroy his enemy. The thing that they fail to realize, despite us repeatedly repeating it, is that that happens under both cases. If indeed the North Korean leader is so irrational and so hell-bent on destroying his enemy, he is going to be acquiring this nuclear weapon even under the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, which he has done as of now, and use this weapon against his enemies. They don't provide any exclusive benefit in that regard. But the second world in which this debate took place is the far more realistic world, where there are indeed rogue leaders, but they are not completely devoid of sensibilities. They act on the basis of self-interest. They often violate international law, but they're still concerned about basic things like whether or not their citizens are going to die or whether or not they themselves are going to be destroyed in this process. In such a case, we told you that you can't go ahead with this false understanding that possession of nuclear weapons is the problem. Because what we tell you is that it's perfectly fine for everyone in the world to possess a nuclear weapon if ultimately that means that each of them is less likely to use that weapon and thus result in nuclear warfare. And we gave you analysis on why leaders have far more incentive to not use a weapon against another person who himself possesses nuclear weapons, as opposed to a situation which is what they can provide, right? Where, for example, they might possibly face the threat of other states acting against them, but there's no guarantee. And in fact, we told you it's extremely unlikely that leaders will face retaliation for using nuclear weapons under the NPT regime. So we said that overall it's far more likely that a greater deterrent is created against the use of nuclear weapons when indeed more people in the world have nuclear weapons. But let's also deal with the other thing that they said, right? The second assumption that they made in this debate is that under an NPT regime, we can supervise the supply of nuclear weapons and that rogue states will never be able to get these nuclear weapons. That's not factually correct, as we repeatedly told you. The reason why Iran and North Korea was able to rely on back channels to gain these nuclear weapons is precisely because they have the hell-bent desire to destroy their enemies. And if that's the case, they have all the incentive to try and procure nuclear weapons, even in a non-proliferation regime, which means that their assumption about cutting off the supply of weapons simply doesn't stand. We spoke to you about the idea of dependence, something that they never responded to. We said that when only some countries have the ability of nuclear power, it results in them having an unfair advantage in negotiations in every other respect, like trade negotiations or economic negotiations. The only response they gave was that hegemony already exists in the world. But that possibly can't be a reason to extend this hegemony by giving these few selected groups of nations an even greater power to control the negotiations between them. And finally, they said, what about countries that don't have nuclear weapon technology, that can't possibly develop these? Here again, look at it this way, right? Right now, some countries like Iran have nuclear weapons and they want to use it against their enemies. Their enemies may possibly have the capability to develop these weapons, but they can't do so because the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty and the regime doesn't allow them to do it legally. The defense that can be given to that country is overall worse off under your model, where these countries can, but can't, but cannot, are not allowed to do this process. And in a case where both countries anyway lack the ability to develop nuclear weapons at all, that again is a harm that exists on both sides of this house. Overall, there's no clear benefit that has been shown by side opposition, and the likelihood of nuclear warfare breaking out is far lower under our model, which is why we win this debate.
We thank government reply and we thank all the speakers. Please cross the house.
But it is doing it. Yeah, there are in 10 minutes you will have 4 of those. Sure. I'm not I'll make the announcement about the topic. Yeah. Conflict data, they don't want to they want us to collect conflict data separately. We rented this software, I have to, so I'm doing like we have to do that. Okay, you now have about 10 minutes to arrive at your individual decisions. Do not confer to arrive at the decision. There is another announcement. All judges who have conflicts or teams that they cannot judge, other than the institutions that they belong to already, should report to me or Rudro after you finish your judge test. So we will be here. You will go down and give your judge test on a first come first serve basis. There will be a volunteer that will come and tell you which rooms the judge score is in. Just organize yourselves around those rooms. It's a first come first serve policy. We don't have like specific people that will go to specific judge score members. You can just go to whichever one is free at that particular point in time and finish off your test. We will get you the venue shortly, but as soon as your interview is done, if you have any people that you cannot judge that are not from your institution, do come and report to us so that we can enter that data into the tab so that we can prevent later on changes to matchups and stuff of that sort. Is that clear? Like, are there questions? Okay, cool. Good luck.
We gave the venues and the order.
Yeah, there is no order here. Let's go. There's no allocation. First come, first serve. Go to judges.